some fears are legitimate and some are not. So if somebody's coming at you with a gun, or a tornado's coming down the block, or you see a brown bear coming at you out of the woods, that's legitimate fear. Run for your life or find something to protect you. That all makes sense. But walking into a buyer's office, or walking on a stage to address a crowd, or writing something that's going to be published, writer's block is a myth, by the way. All these are illegitimate fears.
Hi, I'm James Taylor, business creativity and innovation keynote speaker, and this is The Creative Life, a show dedicated to you, the creative. If you're looking for motivation, inspiration, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's an author, musician, entrepreneur, performer, designer, or thought leader. They'll share with you their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, and much, much more. You'll find show notes for this episode, as well as free training on creativity, over at jamestaylor.me. Enjoy this episode. Hi there, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to have on the show Alan Weiss. Alan is a consultant, speaker, and best-selling author, described by the New York Post as one of the most highly regarded independent consultants in America. His consulting firm, Summit Consulting Group, Inc., has attracted clients such as Merck, Hewlett-Packard, GE, Mercedes-Benz, and more than 500 leading organizations. He is the author of 64 books, and his latest is called Fearless Leadership, Overcoming Reticence, Procrastination, and the Voices of Doubt Inside Your Head. It's my great pleasure to have Alan with us today. So welcome, Alan.
Thanks, James. Good to be here.
So share with us what's happening in your world at the moment.
Wow, God. Well, let's see. I'm working on my a new book. We haven't even named it yet, but I'm talking to agents about that. I've invented a new approach to strategy that just takes one day. It's called Sentient Strategy, and it avoids spending weeks or even months on a strategy for 3 years out. That's going to be meaningless in 10 days after that. So it's an approach to set strategy in a day. I'm also helping people with establishing communities that are real and virtual, so that you bring people together and that value accrues to you as bringing these people together who otherwise would know each other. It's patterned on my global community. And of course, in a time of social consciousness, and also in a time of some fear of travel right now, because we're recording this during the coronavirus scare, these kinds of communities are more important than ever. So, my life continues to be very exciting.
So I have to ask, with all this kind of going on, where do you find that time to write these books as well? That'll be your 65th book, I'm guessing. So how do you do it?
Well, I tell most people I go for volume and not accuracy, and some people actually believe that. Look, we go with our strengths, right? And I am an excellent writer and excellent speaker. When I was fired in 1985, I said, I'm going to work on my strengths, writing and speaking, and that will get me ahead. I'm not going to try to do things I'm not good at. And most self-help books try to make you good at things you're not good at, which is absurd. So, a publisher wants a book in 6 months. I give it to them in 4, and I actually write it in 2. I work about 20 hours a week, and I can write very fast. I can touch type very fast on a keyboard, and I don't self-edit. And the key to writing well and at length and quickly is you don't self-edit. If you're an expert, you say there are 4 points for anything. You don't go back and say, well, maybe there were 5 or maybe there were 3. You just keep going. And most people hurt themselves in speaking and writing because they self-edit too much.
Now, you are known as the kind of godfather, the chairman of consulting. I see the Frank Sinatra picture you have behind you just now. How did you get into this world of consulting, this space of consulting?
I was recruited from the insurance business in my 20s to a consulting firm in Princeton, New Jersey. I went in there as a neophyte service guy, and 11 years later, I left as the president of a division, working for the owner. I then went up to Providence, where I was recruited to be CEO of a consulting firm, behavioral consulting firm, and the owner of that firm, who was a global financier, W. Clement Stone, he and I didn't get along, and 18 months later, he fired me. And I said to myself 2 things, and my wife supported me. The first was, this is a relationship business. And it's about how you establish relationships and sell yourself. And the second thing is, I would never charge by a time unit or a person sitting in a seat or a box of materials. I would only charge by value. And I pioneered value-based fees in consulting. And in 1992, I released what I think is the seminal book on consulting, which is $1 Million Consulting, which is on the shelves now for 28 years through 5 editions. So you have to be bold. You have to stick with, your principles, and you have to take a contrarian view of things. And I've been successful.
I remember reading, I think it was the Consulting Bible. I'm not sure if that came before the Million Dollar Consulting.
That was after.
That was after. And I remember that was one of the key takeaways for me reading that book, was the idea of this values-based fees. And obviously this has become a common thing. A lot of people kind of think about this and talk about this now, but you were the guy that really put that forward in a big, big way. And I know a lot of speakers and consultants have a lot to thank you for as well in changing their thinking on that space.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, as far as we can tell, with what research is available, that's not too grand a term. I've written more books on consulting than anyone else ever. But my last 4 or 5 books have moved away to a different kind of population, which is why now we're talking about fearless leadership. So it's been a wonderful journey.
So what was the reason between moving? You know, we hear often a lot of speakers, they're told like, find your niche or your niche, and then kind of just go deep on that and just kind of focus on that. But I've noticed in these last couple of books, as you say, you've kind of moved and you've expanded into other places. Was this just a personal feel that you had, or you just had these things to say and you just needed to kind of get them out into the world?
Well, I think you, as an entrepreneur or as a business leader, you have to be intellectually curious if you're going to be a decent leader, a decent role model, a thought leader. And I was very curious about why people did not always succeed with value-based fees. I thought it was obvious you could get wealthy while providing the client with a ton of value. And I realized that people had self-esteem issues. And so they couldn't say it's $100,000. You know, they start to stutter. It's So I looked into esteem and I started writing on esteem and how to build self-esteem. And then I said, okay, a lot of people are making progress, but why don't enough people raise their self-esteem? And I realized it was fear. So I'm always looking for the cause of the cause of the cause. And so my latest book is on fear, because people are afraid. And as a matter of fact, if you look at this coronavirus, it's causing more harm economically than it is medically, because people are afraid. They fear fear.
I'm interested now, as you kind of a different stage in your life, as you start to look back, is there a golden thread that goes across all of your work? Is there, people like Stephen King, the writer, often talks about, if you kind of looks at, there's a number of kind of 2 kind of key themes that go across all of his work. I think it was Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl said sometimes you only realize what that thing is at the end of the movie, almost, or when you kind of look back on the previous chapters or the previous scenes in your life. Are you getting a sense of what that is, or are you still exploring that and being intellectually curious and trying to find out what that thing is?
James, I want to tell you how good a question that is, because I have done conservatively, 5,000 or 6,000 interviews, and no one's ever asked me that question. And I do know what the thread is. And the thread is that people think 2 things. They think that life is a search for meaning, and they think that they create a legacy when they die. And the point is that life is about creating meaning, and that we create our legacy every day. Every day we write another page in the book of our lives. And the question is it the same page as yesterday, or is someone else writing that page for us? So my thread, if you will, is that we have to create meaning for ourselves that will enrich ourselves and others. And I mean enrich spiritually, not financially. And that we create legacy every minute that we're willing to create legacy. It's just like somebody selling a business. You don't create high valuation on the day before you want to sell it. You have to do that now for selling it 20 years from now. And we have to create our legacy every day. So that is the thread, and that is what I'm following.
So this new book, Fearless Leadership, it kind of talks about that thing that kind of holds us back from creating and adding that value in the world as well. So can you tell us a little bit? I mean, we often hear this kind of fear, and we think about fight or flight, but you actually talk about 3 Fs in the book. There's something else that we're kind of perhaps missing when we think about fear.
Right. We think of our brain react, this reptilian brain, or the amygdala, another part of the brain, about flight or fight. So supposedly our distant ancestors would either run from danger or fight it. But if you look at modern times, there's fight, there's flight, and there's fright. And if you look at a deer in the headlights, the deer knows it can't fight what's coming at it, doesn't even understand it, and it's too paralyzed to flee. And so it's just frightened and stays there, and it's often killed. And in this society and economy and in this world, fright often gets us killed metaphorically because we don't do anything. And for years and years and years, young kids, I know I did this, we would think there's a monster under the bed. And sometimes we get up enough nerve to get a flashlight and look under the bed, and there was never a monster there, and we'd be reaffirmed for at least that evening. But, if you look back on it, my feeling is that you never definitely know there was never a monster under the bed. You only know there wasn't one when you looked. But the empirical fact is, even though there was a monster under the bed, perhaps, it never harmed you. And so the evidence is the monster doesn't harm you even if it's there. And we can't afford to be frightened today. And we're frightened by the unknown. We're frightened by the ambiguous. We're frightened by social norms. We're frightened by political correctness. And it's killing us.
So how do we start to recognize between these real and perhaps fabricated fears that we have in our lives?
Well, in the book, I separated them into overt and covert fears. And so some fears are legitimate and some are not. So if somebody's coming at you with a gun, or a tornado's coming down the block, or you see a brown bear coming at you out of the woods, that's legitimate fear. Run for your life or find something to protect you. That all makes sense. But walking into a buyer's office, or walking on a stage to address a crowd, or writing something that's going to be published, writer's block is a myth, by the way. All these are illegitimate fears, because if you think of them rationally and empirically, for example, no one comes into an audience to listen to a speaker for an hour hoping the speaker fails. They don't want to go home, at least 95% of them who are mentally healthy, don't want to go home and say, what a great morning I had. I just watched someone go down in flames and I helped to heckle them. What they want to do is go back to their office or back to their homes and say, what an enriching morning. I learned a lot I can use. And so the fact that you should fear public speaking is absurd. And the psychologists and therapists who deal with it correctly can easily cure it. But we have these phobias, and the phobia is really fear of fear. There's 1/10 of 1% of spiders are dangerous. 1/10 of 1% of snakes are dangerous. But we come to fear all spiders and all snakes. And it's like the cat that jumps on a hot stove, and in the future it won't even jump on a cold stove because it doesn't know the difference. We are sentient creatures, and we should know the difference. So we have to unearth these fears and find out what their cause is to get rid of them.
So you spoke about some of those fears perhaps have a basis in our evolution, the snake coming out of the grass, and there's things like that you mentioned, like the amygdala as well. But today, where do you see a lot of these fears coming from? What are the more psychological aspects, not the actual necessarily the environmental aspects?
Well, this is why I evolved here. I migrated here from esteem. I think that we fear damage to our egos. And instead of tucking our egos down in the cargo hold of the ship, where they're safe and they're stored, we put them on the bow of the ship, and they get obliterated by wind and rain and waves and everything else. The problem is that we're actually afraid of being embarrassed. We're afraid that we'll be wrong. We don't want to be seen in public as saying something that other people don't approve of. This is why political correctness is so horrible and such an impediment to free speech, because people cow before it. They are afraid of it, because they don't want to be seen as going against the norms. There's something psychologically that is called the threshold experience, which, in rough terms looks like this. A decent person standing in the street in the middle of a riot, who knows better, who has high degrees of ethics and high personal beliefs, nonetheless goes into a store and steals something because the normative pressure around that person is so great. Everyone's stealing. A soldier who's brave sees everyone around him or her fleeing a battle, and they get up and flee, not because they're not brave, but because the normative pressure is to flee. Or vice versa, if your belief is I should flee, but no one else is, you'll stay there. So there's a threshold of normative pressure, social pressure, that overcomes your belief system. And we're seeing that today in terms of people being fearful of acting and just silly stuff. I mean, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, just a couple of days ago, ran an article on how to make employees happy. And making employees happy isn't the point. So, and not all customers are always right. But we seem to think that every grievance should be attended to. And that's just a crazy philosophy.
Now, I think your father, he served in World War II. And I often watch it. I was watching on a flight coming home from somewhere recently and seeing that level of fear. It was actually U-boat commanders. That's what it was. And how they dealt with that fear. And they said that the training kicked in. That there was something, all those kind of months of training that kind of kicked in to help you kind of do that thing that you had to do, go over that wall, or fight that particular fight. In the work that we have to do today, whether that's launch that product, write that blog post, film that video, whatever the thing is, that's going on. what kind of training can we start to do for ourselves in order to, that when we do have to start doing these things, the training kicks in? Is there a kind of training for increasing levels of low self-esteem or a perfectionism?
Well, it's more about coaching and training, and that is a behavioral change, not a skill acquisition. But I'll give you a very clear example. My father never talked about the war, very rarely. And I finally said to him, he jumped with no reserve chute. He was the first paratroop regiment ever formed in the United States in 1940. And after Pearl Harbor, they shipped him to Australia, and he parachuted no reserve chute at about 500 feet or so with his colleagues into the jungles in New Guinea to fight the Japanese. And of course, here he was jumping with all his colleagues. The normative pressure was, you jumped with your colleagues, you protected each other, and a lot of men were killed. And I said to him, "How did you do that?" And he said, "Well, you jumped with your buddies, and you just assumed it wouldn't be you." Now, here's the training or the coaching that you're alluding to. When you walk into a buyer's office, not only do you assume that no harm is going to come to you, you should be assuming that it's a great opportunity. Moreover, again, I'm always for empirical testing. No one ever walked into a buyer's office and walked out poorer than when they walked in. No buyer ever took money from the marketing person, from the salesperson. No buyer ever operates like in a cartoon where there's a lever and a trap door and the salesperson disappears down a trap door. So the fact is you can't get harmed in there. And if you believe when you get up in the morning, not that you have to make sales to pay the mortgage, but that you have tremendous value that you can give to people, you'll find that you're never feeling that you're intruding. You're always feeling that you're helping, that you'd be remiss if you didn't try to help. So that's the mental attitude you have to have, as opposed to fearing. Some people get up and they say, "Boy, what a day, another long, slow crawl through enemy territory." And you can't succeed that way.
Actually, what you're saying, it reminds me a little bit, obviously we're going through this coronavirus issue just now as well. There was that Mr. Rogers quote, and he said, whenever you see terrible things going on in the world and people being fearful, look for the helpers. Look for those people who are helping. They're doing something. They're being active in some kind of positive way. So it sounds like what you're saying, part of it is there's a mental game that you're having to play there as well. With many of the very senior leaders, senior executives, CEOs that you work with, are there common themes that you see in terms of fears of why they don't do what is necessary to transform their organizations or lead in a very positive way?
Yeah, and it's not their fears so much as their reaction to the fears. We can't avoid pain. Pain happens to all of us. We lose a loved one. Someone has an illness. We're disappointed in something. However, suffering is voluntary. And so when you experience pain, whatever emotions you have are real. But the question is, what do you do about it? So what I've found is that executives, the kind of people you're talking about, have the same emotional and political and intellectual problems that people on the front line have, but they're playing with more money. The question for an effective executive is, what do you do about it? Because what you do about it has a lot more ramification. And people have to learn that it's okay to make mistakes. The best leaders I've seen are consistent in how they approach crises or ambiguity. They do things so other people follow them. They say, "Follow me. I'm on the horse. I have the light. Follow me." And they don't fear failure. And when you fear failure, when you try not to lose instead of trying to win, you will usually lose. So they have these qualities that say, "Follow me, move forward. I'm not sure of what to do, but I have some good ideas. Let's try them. If they don't work, we'll try something else." They're resilient, and they don't fear being embarrassed in front of other people.
And can you tell us about a time in your own work, what you do as a speaker, consultant, author, when you gave something your best, you went in there with that kind of attitude, but it didn't work out like you hoped? And more importantly, what was the lesson that you took from that experience?
Well, first of all, my philosophy is you prepare well, you show up, you do your best, and you go home. You can't do more than that. What you and I do is not going to change the course of Western civilization. And so part of the legacy I talked about earlier is I try to help people. And if I help one person a day, that's great. If I help more than one person a day, even better. But if I make a mistake doing that, I learn from it and I move on. And so if a speech doesn't work out, you say, "Look, did I prepare well? Did I show up on time? Did I do my best? And if so, go home. There's nothing else you could do." But if you didn't prepare and you didn't do your best and you were distracted, then you know what you have to improve next time. And sometimes it's the audience. I mean, my wife has said to me after a speech, there was nothing you could have done. It was like a black hole out there, nothing you could have done. And other times she said to me, what on earth were you thinking? So fortunately, there aren't too many of those, but it happens, and you can't let it get you down. I mean, you can't suffer a loss, whether it's a poor speech or you don't get a job you wanted, an assignment you wanted, or your pet dies, God forbid. You can't take a loss and let that pain cause you endless suffering. You have to decide what I do about it, and that regains control for us. But too often we cede control, CEDE. We allow control to be taken by someone else, and then we're helpless.
In terms of how these trying to help people and going this kind of fearless sensibility, how those kind of two things coexist with each other. I was talking to someone the other day, and she's a kind of YouTube, Instagram star, and she very big following online. But she's now having to look at better ways to monetize that. And she said, I feel fearful because I put myself, I've kind of added all this value. I'm always kind of trying to help people with my videos and everything that she's creating online. And I'm not really sure how I can capture some of this value that I'm creating as well. What advice would you give to someone like her who has that fear, but she's kind of going in it from the right perspective in terms of trying to help people? It's just like she's not capturing some of that value.
Well, what you're really saying is she's not capturing the monetization. She's not capturing repayment for the value. And I face this all the time with people. This is an esteem issue, and they feel like an imposter. And so your friend feels as if she's popular because she's giving away free advice, but if she charged for it, she wouldn't be as popular. It's an esteem issue. But I'll go back to empirical evidence. People believe they get what they pay for. Nobody needs a Bentley for transportation, or a Bulgari watch to tell the time, or a Brioni suit to cover you. But there's an emotional involvement in these things. They make you feel good and you're willing to pay for them. And on a smaller scale, we do that with things every day. So it's not unusual in a capitalist philosophy that we get what we pay for. And I think there's an interesting element here that a lot of people who have been in trouble financially, that is, they're not making enough sales, their product isn't moving, when they raise prices, all they do is raise prices, their business improves because it's a better image for them. And so I would say to her, get used to losing some of the people who refuse to pay for anything because they have a scarcity mentality. But most of your people, most of them, don't have a scarcity mentality. They have an abundance mentality, and they will accept the fact that you are entitled to equitable compensation for your value. And so go that route boldly, but don't tiptoe in. Don't charge a little and then a little more. Arrive at a price and move forward. And you'll find also that outside this community you already have, you'll draw a lot more people.
That's some great advice there. And tell us about, in your work, you have 64, 65 books now, or you're speaking, you work with some amazing companies. Has there been a key insight or light bulb moment in your life, especially your creative journey, your journey as a creator?
Well, I think the light bulb creatively is really one of fearlessness. I mean, this is way before the book, but people have called me fearless in the sense that I'm innovative. I'm always willing to try things. And if something doesn't work, I just cancel it, or I reschedule, or I do something else. But it's never been a blow to my ego. And so, so I forget who said this. I'd give them credit. Maybe it was Edison, but somebody said, the way to have a good idea is to have a lot of ideas. And the way to be innovative is to try to be innovative all the time. And so I'm never afraid to be innovative. I mean, anybody can fix a problem, but raising standards is something else. So that's always been of comfort to me creatively, that I can try that. I don't care if somebody doesn't like my work. Somebody said, I have a lot of free newsletters, right, on my site. And somebody said, well, you published an article I disagree with. And if you keep doing this, I can't subscribe anymore. And I said to her, let me get this straight. You're going to unsubscribe to a free newsletter because you don't agree with one of my columns. Please, I'm not interested. The other thing I would tell you is I never listen to unsolicited feedback. I listen to feedback from people I respect and ask. But if you give me unsolicited feedback, I ignore it every time. And so I never look at a smile sheet. I never look at some kind of evaluation after I speak. I don't care. I do what I do. And then the other breakthrough I've had, I think, is something you just touched on, and that is it's not just the creative process. It's dealing with high-level and powerful people. And I have found that I am not as cynical as a lot of people. I don't find conspiracies among corporations. I don't find executives making monetary decisions to the detriment of the public. Are there some of those? Yes. You can look at Volkswagen or Wells Fargo or Enron. But if you look at the millions of other companies that don't do that, you find that's the rule. And I found that these executives are always willing to talk rationally about pragmatic help that will improve their products and services and their value. And I found once I learned that, it was easy to consult.
Now, just switching gears for a moment, in that Bentley you were just talking about, is there an online resource or a tool or an app like Evernote, for example, you find very useful in the work that you do, especially writing, speaking, traveling all the time?
No. I write from my head to the screen. I use American Express to make my travel reservations. I write very well on planes and trains. So I use technology to the extent that it's really helpful and doesn't get in my way. So if I have a sophisticated computer, an iPhone and everything else, I use 20% of them to 100% effectiveness. The other 80% I hardly touch. In 84, I guess, in Megatrends, Nesbitt had it right, high tech, high touch. He's a true prophet that way. And all these years later, the higher the tech, the higher the touch better be. So, that's my reaction. There is no shortcut here. There's discipline and accountability.
And if you could recommend one book, not one of your own books, a book by another author to our listeners, and also one record, one album, because I've noticed you've got some music there behind you as well. What would that book and that record be?
Well, the record would be the concert Sinatra. Sinatra was one of my heroes because he sang the American songbook better than anyone ever in history and that anyone ever will. And the Great American Songbook is full of lyrics that you can remember, and they're stories. And he told the story in the singing like no one else. And so the concert Sinatra has Old Man River and This Nearly Was Mine and so forth. Just some of the greatest songs ever written by the greatest lyricists and composers. So the concert Sinatra would be if I had to pick one album, which is very difficult, it would be that one. If I had to pick one book, it would be a novel. And I would say that probably I would separate out The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. And Steinbeck, of course, talks about the terrible Dust Bowl and the Depression and what happened to these farmers in Oklahoma who had to try to go to California. It is an unremitting tale of woe and horror. And, people today don't realize that they live in privileged times. They have social safety nets. They have families. They have technology. And you read about these people back then and how they persevered in Steinbeck's incredible prose. You learn more than you learn from any business book.
And let's imagine, Alan, that you woke up tomorrow morning and you have to start from scratch. So you've got all the tools, all the knowledge that you've acquired over the years, but no one knows you and you know no one. What would you do? How would you restart things?
I'd give 2 or 3 pieces of advice to myself or to anyone else. The first is reach out to everyone you know, because even though you just started, you know a lot of people. Reach out to every single person you know and contact them and offer value, because they might be a buyer or they might be a recommender, or they might just be somebody else, but it's important that they know you're there and what you're doing. The second is gather names ruthlessly. I did not do this when I started. I mean, there was no technology like this when I began in the late 80s, but there was no excuse. I still could have kept the names. So gather names ruthlessly. And then the third piece of advice is you need to be contrarian and provocative. You have to stand out in a crowd. If you're going to be part of the herd, you'll be a commodity. So be absolutely fearless in pointing people in different directions.
Well, Alan, thank you so much for coming on today, sharing about your lessons and being fearless and being less kind of fearful in life. Where is the best place for people to go to learn more about you, your work, get their copies of the book?
If you go to alanweiss.com, ALANWEISS.com, you can order the book, but you'll also find hundreds of free articles, free video, free audio, all kinds of things that you can get every month absolutely for free. And I have to tell you, in all candor, if you want to get the book at the best possible price, don't go to my site, because I have to provide a retail price that the publisher provides. But go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or a place like that where they have great discounts and get the book there, either in hard copy or Kindle. I'm not really concerned about book royalties. I'm concerned about people enriching themselves and their lives.
Well, Alan, thank you so much for coming on today, sharing with us all about your creative life. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks, James. I had a great time. Thank you so much.
If you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.